I read Dawnshard by Brandon Sanderson for the Summer of Cosmere, where I'm reading every Cosmere story in their published order. So this will include spoilers for everything up to this point: Elantris Warbreaker, Mistborn Eras 1 and 2, Stormlight Archive about halfway through, and some short stories. So lots and lots of stuff here. And I don't think this story would really make sense if you haven't read the Stormlight Archive books anyway, because it's about the interstitial character of Risen, who is a kind of like trainee of the greatest merchant in the world, I guess. And I haven't really talked about any of the interstitial characters, even though I think they're all wonderful. And I really love Risen. So it's cool to get to slow down a little bit and zoom in on her story. So to recap what happened in The Way of Kings, Words of Radiance, and Oathbringer, as far as Risen is concerned, when we first meet her, she's quite a bit younger than this, and she doesn't know anything about the world, and she has all of these preconceived notions about how to be an excellent trader, which have to do with like an orientation of assuming that her culture is superior to everyone else's culture, that the way of doing things for the Thalens is like the right way to do them. And obviously anybody with their head screwed on straight would do it that way. And her tutor, or mentor, I should say, the Stim, has this really beautiful approach to setting up deals where he thinks of everything from the perspective of his customers and what are their needs, how can their needs be served, and that he wants to like understand where they're coming from. He operates from a place of empathy, basically, and he doesn't assume any kind of superiority and sees everyone in the world, like as part of a large cooperative community that everybody can be dealt with. And you can make a deal with anybody if you see things from their perspective and have enough information and I guess have what they want. And so most of the deals that we get to see them do have to do with like breaking down Risen's prejudices and getting her into the practice of the Vistim's approach, where she's trying to see things from the customer's side of the table. And eventually they go to these really cool islands that are alive, that they are these like enormous great shelled creatures that are so big that an entire island worth of people live on them. And these things just like crawl through the giant Pure Lake area, which is like a very shallow ocean. And the people who live on the island worship it as a god. And they have all kinds of cultural idiosyncrasies that have to do with like boldness. And the problem in that story is that Vistim has gotten sick and Risen has to complete the trade, and it's already been pre-negotiated, and all she needs to do is like lock in the deal. But the thing is that because the way that their culture values boldness, they see the sickness as like a weakness in Vistim, and so they want to back out of the deal. They want to keep the money that was paid to them, but not deliver the goods. And it's been put to Risen that like this, if they don't make this trade, it's going to ruin their entire trip. They're not going to be able to continue with the rest of their, like trading mission. It's going to mess everything up. And so she really needs to close the deal. And it turns out that the whole thing is like kind of a test, but Risen doesn't understand that. It's like her first chance to close the deal without Vistim there holding her hand. And she goes too far and ends up like trying to impress them by jumping off the island and talking to the great shell directly by like dangling from a rope and yelling at it. And she ends up getting injured and falling into the water. But since it's not very deep, she just hits the bottom and it leads to her becoming paralyzed. And then after this, the stem sets her up with a kind of cushy job back in Thalena and being in charge of the treasury. And she has to like radically reassess the way that she sees herself. She's like dealing with feelings of shame and self-pity while at the same time having this pretty important job. But it's also like a pretty lonely job. And at the end of Oathbringer, Odium arranges his forces there in Thalena, and they raid the repository where Risen works, and the Voidbringers like disguise themselves magically to look like soldiers in order to infiltrate the place, and then they steal the special gemstones that they have there, which can hold Stormlight for an infinite amount of time because of the perfection of the stones, which ends up becoming instrumental for Dalinar's story and trapping the thrill. But the point being for Risen's story that these creatures try to kill her and she narrowly escapes. When she survives the encounter with the island, she is awarded this unique creature to Roshar called a Larkin that most people thought were extinct, and they didn't even know that there are any living ones left. And so it's extremely valuable. And it's kind of like attached to her. There doesn't seem to be like a magical bond, but they just care for each other a lot. And the thing can eat Stormlight. And it turns out it can also eat Voidlight. And so Chiri Chiri is the name of the Larkin, and it saves her during this attack by taking away the Voidbringer's powers. And she ends up being able to narrowly escape. But the whole thing is extremely traumatic for her. And right before the attack happens, Vistim also tells her that like he didn't realize that the job was not a good fit for her and that he is being forced to retire and take a high position in the government. He's getting too old to do this kind of work anymore. And so he's going to bequeath his ship that's called the Wandersail, that's kind of like an experimental ship, and give it to Risen because he feels like this will be good for her now that she needs something better to do than the job that she was doing at the treasury. And so that's where this story picks up. She has the Wandersail and she's going to go on an adventure with it. And basically she gets enlisted by Navani to go to this mysterious island called Akina, which also appeared in another interstitial story, which I also didn't talk about. And Akina seems to be important in that interstitial story because of its connection to soul casters. But there's like a conspiracy that intervenes in the trip that tries to go there and destroys everyone in the crew. And that's part of what Navani wants the mystery of that whole thing solved. But also there is an oath gate on the island, and she wants to find out what the status of the oath gate is for the security of Urithiru. But the real reason that Risen is interested in going to Akina is because Chiri Chiri is getting sick. And she finds out that the only way to cure the animal is to go to this place, which is the native habitat for its species. And so the cure will hopefully be there. And so conveniently, like Navani needs a mission to go there. And so this kind of like funds her ability to go there and additionally gets her some security in the form of some windrunners, which include Lopen. And so the main perspectives that we get in the story are from Risen and Lopen. It's a lot of fun to get Lopen's POV. He's just as goofy on the inside as he is on the outside. But we get to see a little bit of Lopen's soft underbelly at the end of the story as well. So that's like, I love how well-rounded Sanderson's characters are. Even the, comedy relief characters feel like complete and real people. And Risen has so much vulnerability to her, for this kind of side interstitial character. She doesn't need to be as compelling as she is, but I think that she carries the story beautifully. And, there's so much complexity to her. It's really fun to follow on her adventure. So the main thing that she kind of is dealing with in the story, I think, is a feeling of imposter syndrome, that she is not as good as Vistim. And so she's never going to like live up to that legacy. And being in charge of this trip is beyond her capability. But she is willing to give it a try. She needs to make it work because of Cheery Cheery. When she negotiates the price of payment with Navani, she asks her about the Fabrial technology that they've developed to make these levitating platforms for archers and stuff like that. And so basically, like, Navani has figured out levitation on Roshar. Has nothing to do with like Bernoulli's principles or anything like that. It's all just, magical stuff. And her idea is that she wants to make her wheelchair float, or that she would in some way be able to kind of fly and not have to rely on the wheelchair, which is like a really limiting device for her, given, like there's no paved roads in Roshar, right? And so Navani also sends Rushu on the trip, who is like her right-hand woman, kind of one of the members of the Ardentia, a clearly like ADHD afflicted person, or maybe like pretty autistic. There's quite a few autistic characters in the Cosmere. I don't really ever talk about them. I mean, obviously Renarin, Steris probably also. And so like Rushu is interesting in the way that her mind is just constantly moving at like 100 miles per hour. She's just always going on to the next connection to the thing that she is supposed to be doing, and her mind wanders a lot. But she manages to be able to figure out how to do the floating wheelchair for Risen in the story. So that's like a cool thing going forward, that Risen has this kind of chair that can float as long as she has infused gems in the Fabrials. Also, Rock's daughter goes along with them because she can see Spren, and so this will help them to kind of figure out the answer to the mystery of what happened to the lost ship. And there's just all kinds of problems with them trying to get to the island that are very similar to that other interstitial story, where there's bad omens and there's potential mutiny brewing among the crew. And finally, Risen is able to figure out like who the traitor is and kicks them off of the ship. But it kind of doesn't matter, because you find out that this person that they kicked off the ship, who is named Neekly, is actually one of these creatures or groups of creatures, a horde of creatures called the Sleepless. And this kind of character has shown up a few other times in the Stormlight Archive. I haven't talked about them at all. They're an interesting world building idea. They're kind of like a hive mind collective type of creature that impersonate different species by deliberately evolving or breeding to have different parts of the human body, in this case, like grow on the back of the insects, and then they just kind of like clutch together and it forms a person. It's a really grotesque idea, fascinating idea, really alien body horror kind of stuff going on. They're really creepy whenever they show up. But also they're like usually pretty benevolent. I mean, he's trying to kill everyone in the crew, so maybe that's naive of me. But the intention of the Sleepless doesn't seem to be like an agenda of malice or evil. They're just trying to protect the secret that's on this island. And so that's why they stopped the other crew and destroyed their ship, because it's kind of like for the greater good sort of thing. And from what Neakley says in the story, it seems like the Sleepless, or maybe he himself, have been around since before the shattering and witnessed the shattering, and that they feel like it's their responsibility as a species to kind of guard all of the Cosmere and make sure that this type of event doesn't happen again, and that the treasure that's in this place, the Dawnshard, where the story gets its name, was instrumental in the shattering. And so they're just trying to guard against something like that ever happening again. And so it's basically like an enemy that can't be killed, that has this deep lore and knowledge, that has an enormous amount of control. And basically, the whole point of that is that it cannot be overwhelmed. But like we've seen in other, the other short story in the Stormlight Archive, Edge Dancer, and over again throughout the Stormlight Archive, honestly, the way to solve this problem is kind of like through radical empathy. And Risen uses her abilities taught to her by Vistim to see things the way that the Sleepless see them, and to offer them a solution to their problem, to sell them on, what they need so that she can get what she needs. And she's able to persevere and convince them to allow her to hold the Dawnshard within her body somehow, that she didn't even intentionally take the Dawnshard or anything. It just kind of happened to her. But basically she pitches to them that like, hey, I hold this power now, and if you let me go, it'll be much, much harder for people to find it, because nobody's going to be looking for me to have it. And so I will be a good guardian for this power going forward. This whole thing is kind of interesting when you look at it, we just got through with White Sand, and, all of the ideas about the place of autonomy and community, and the way that, Risen has to become a leader that can be respected by the crew, and how she does that without using like overwhelming force or a particular kind of mastery of them or magical powers. Instead, she's doing it through this connection of reciprocity. That I think that when we usually think of business people, we think about kind of exploitation. We think of overwhelming power in order to negotiate deals that are one-sided. But that's not really a healthy way to conduct business. And I think that Risen demonstrates the kind of virtue of that, Aristotelian mean that I've talked about before. That's a more balanced approach. She's not trying to take everything that other people have and keep as much for herself as possible. Instead, she's trying to find a balance that benefits everybody in the business arrangement all the way through the story. This is how Vistim trained her to be. And while she's, has this problem of feeling like an imposter, when you compare where she is in Dawnshard to where she began in The Way of Kings, you can see like she's vastly different, and she's really internalized all of those lessons from Vistim and grown quite a bit. And even though she's gone through these, terrible traumas, she manages to have the fortitude to keep pushing ahead. She's not like a knight radiant. She's not one of these heroes in the story who has this supernatural power kind of pouring into the cracks in her soul formed by trauma. Instead, she just has her own sense of persistence and duty, not only to her crew and, the stem, but also Cheery Cheery. And she wants to stay alive. I mean, that's really the stakes of the moment when she's confronting Neekly, in the climax. It's a life or death situation, and there's no way that she could possibly overwhelm an opponent like this. And so coming to an accord is the only way for her to get through the situation. But I don't think it's like a purely cynical move on her part. Instead, I think it's a genuine connection of inclusion and community. I mean, the Sleepless themselves are a kind of unique, interesting form of community and empathy and connection, right? Like just symbolically, the way that they have a hive mind, but they are also, grotesque and weird and unbalanced, because I think they're like so monological. Even though they talk about like, well, we were debating, some people just wanted to kill you outright, but I said, we should hold off and have a conversation. So I don't mean to present them as like a monolith, but when hundreds of creatures combine together to make an individual human body, that seems, kind of monolithic to me. That's what I'm talking about when I say that. They're a community that is utterly oriented towards like one way of doing things or one particular goal of defending the treasure of this island, where Risen's goal is more fluid. It's less rigid. It has to do with connection to somebody else. It's not so closed off in the way that the Sleepless goal is. She is able to connect with anyone and form some kind of a deal. And so this, I think, is another, vector that we can look at goodness and badness in the Cosmere, this kind of connection that is formed in an open and empathetic way resonates with all of the other heroic characters that we've encountered in the Cosmere. And of course, the lore implications of the whole thing of the Dawnshard in this enormous power and how it enters into her body is all like really fascinating. It has something to do with the command that originally shattered Adonalsium, according to the Sleepless. And it has something to do with like, we've talked about intent and connection, some of the terms that we learned in the Secret History story. And this is connected to the intent of change. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that when they come to the island, Cheery Cheery goes through some kind of change or metamorphosis and becomes a much larger creature. And the Sleepless inform Risen that they're going to have to come back at some other point for Cheery Cheery again to go through this process again as they get older, because they're going to get bigger and bigger. And so this seems like something like a proto-dragon kind of situation. I mean, it's not a dragon, I understand that, but Cheery Cheery is kind of like a dragon, at least in my imagination. And so once it transforms, it becomes like Cheery Cheery becomes super defensive of Risen, but the deal is struck and she's allowed to keep her life and protect the rest of the crew from the Sleepless attacking them. Additionally, Rock's daughter Cord gets some shards here, which she feels is very important for defending her culture because of the perpendicularity that exists in her homeland. And then Lopen also ends up swearing the third ideal hilariously in the story, and seems to have a romantic interest in Cord also. So there's a connection there between these two characters. But it's nice to see Lopin and Risen together because, of course, Lopin has this very particular approach to his own physical disability where he had lost an arm. And his approach to it was to make a bunch of jokes about only having one arm, where he is kind of in charge of the way that people react to his disability. And while it's an emotional defense mechanism on his part, it's not done with a kind of malicious defensism where he's like mocking the other people. He's sort of making fun of himself or making fun of the situation. He's showing that he can laugh at the misfortune of it, but that also he's okay. And that it's okay for the other person to not feel uncomfortable and weird around him because he doesn't have an arm. And Risen has had to deal with, these feelings of shame and disconnection from community and the ways that people look at her because she has this disability. All of the reactions that they have to her, Lopin talks to her about that. He understands it. They have a good empathetic connection between them where he becomes a person that she can confide in, or he just knows how it is, and they kind of rap about it. And I think that's really good for her while she's gaining confidence of dealing with the crew and gaining their trust, which she's able to do in the course of the story as well, by using the same kind of empathy and making deals with people, seeing things from the crew's side of things, understanding what they need, and then trying to find the way to meet that need. Gains the trust of the crew, and they are loyal to her after this adventure. And so it's a neat little story that bridges the gap between Oathbringer and the upcoming Rhythm of War, which will be the next book that I move on to, the next story. The even bigger Stormlight Archive book, somehow even longer, with more character perspectives, and a really surprising book that has lots of fun elements in it and further evolves this entire situation. And that will be the next story.